Hello everyone, welcome to the final lecture in this academic year's edition of the American Studies Colloquium series. Today it is our great pleasure to host Dr. Patrycja Antoszek from the Department of American Literature and Culture at the John Paul II Catholic University of Lublin, where she teaches courses on American literature and literary theory. Among her research interests are postmodernist literature, literary theory, contemporary Gothic, and psychoanalytic criticism. Dr. Antoszek is the author of several articles on contemporary American novels and short stories. She used to publish extensively on the works of Robert Coover, which culminated in the publication of her 2010 book entitled The Carnivalesque Muse, the New Fiction of Robert Coover. The fiction of Shirley Jackson, who is the focus of today's talk, is going to be the topic of the book Dr. Antoszek is currently working on. Without further ado, please join me in offering a warm welcome to Dr. Patrycja Antoszek.
So thank you very much for this introduction, and I would like to thank especially Dr. Agnieszka Kotwasińska, who invited me here. And I'm going to talk about Shirley Jackson, the American author whose writing has been severely neglected in years after her death, in many decades. One of the reasons for this comparative lack of critical and readerly attention was the complexity and variety of her fiction, which made it difficult to categorize. As T.S. Joshi observes, critics rarely knew what to make of her unclassifiable work, with the result that she was largely ignored both by the mainstream community and by the cadre of Gothic devotees. For a long time, Jackson was recognized primarily as the author of one eponymous short story, The Lottery, published in 1948, which probably everyone in America read at school. It is in the last couple of years that Jackson's writing has received more and more critical and public attention. Most recently, also thanks to the Netflix horror show, inspired by Jackson's most famous and most critically acclaimed novel, The Haunting of Hill House. And I'd like to know how many of you have seen this Netflix production. Did you like it? It was quite popular, and it is quite popular. And how many of you decided to read the original novel after seeing the show? Has anyone read the novel? Okay, so I cannot ask you my next question because I wanted to know how many of you felt disappointed with the book after seeing the show, and what you discovered about the book after the show. The thing is that while two previous film adaptations of the book were rather close to the original text, one was called The Haunting, and it was directed by Robert Wise in 1963, and another adaptation was from 1999. Mike Flanagan's Netflix production is a sort of remix of some of the most characteristic elements of the novel, or as one critic has put it, rather a ransacking or looting the original book for its setting and character names, leaving the rest for the dead. Almost every detail has been shifted and reimagined, and the result is, as you have seen, a contemporary horror full of hokey technical effects and an ending which betrays Jackson's original idea. This new version of The Haunting of Hill House, together with the film adaptation of another of Jackson's novels, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, which will premiere in the United States tomorrow on the 17th of May, and a film about Jackson herself and her complicated life, starring Elizabeth Moss as Shirley, which is going to come out later this year. All these movies appearing virtually at the same time prove beyond any doubt that we do witness a Shirley Jackson's renaissance. Ironically, however, they also prove, and here I mean especially the Netflix's version of Hill House, that Jackson remains, after all these years, one of the most misunderstood and undervalued American writers of the post-war era. Jackson's life was itself a fascinating story, which found its reflection in two truly gripping biographies, one by Judy Oppenheimer, published in 1988, and a very recent one, much rewarded, by Ruth Franklin from 2016. The very titles of these biographical books, Private Demons and A Rather Haunted Life, suggest a lot about Jackson's personal circumstances. She was born in 1916 in San Francisco, but when she was a teenager, her family moved to New England, where she lived for the rest of her life. She was born to conservative middle-class parents who never truly knew what to make of her, especially her mother. As Jackson's biographers insist, the writer's distressing relationship with her own mother, who never loved her unconditionally, if at all, was a source of sadness throughout her life. As Oppenheimer puts it in the opening sentence of her book, she was not the daughter her mother wanted. And as she reveals later, Jackson's mother could go as far as to confess to her daughter that she was the product of a failed abortion. Despite Jackson's many literary successes, Geraldine Jackson never stopped feeling disappointed with her and criticized her throughout her life for her bad hair, her weight, or her refusal to cultivate feminine charm. As Zoe Heller observes in The New Yorker, Jackson's adult life was ostensibly a rebellion against her mother and her mother's values. She became a writer. She grew fat. She married a Jewish intellectual, Stanley Edgar Hyman, and she ran a bohemian household in which she dyed the mashed potatoes green when she felt like it. But she never quite released herself from Geraldine's destructive grip or ceased to be tormented by her disapproval. While Jackson never openly expressed her anguish at being rejected by the mother, she translated her emotional distress into disturbing fictional scenarios of loveless mothering, ambivalent mother-daughter relations, or even acts of matricide. In her marriage to Stanley Edgar Hyman, who soon became a serious literary critic and a college professor, Jackson found another abusive person, as if to replicate the relationship she had with her mother. They married shortly after graduating, in the face of determined opposition from both sets of parents. In 1945, after their first child was born, they settled in Vermont, where Hyman had been offered a post at an all-female college in Bennington. While Hyman continued to pursue his literary and academic career, as well as having multiple affairs with his female students, Jackson did the cooking, the cleaning, the grocery shopping, and the child rearing. She sometimes parodied their life in cartoons she drew herself. And as you can see, I don't know if it's visible clearly enough, but this is a cartoon showing Hyman reclining in an armchair with his newspaper and Jackson carrying boxes and bags of groceries home. And he tells her, "Dear, you know the doctor said you weren't to carry anything heavy." So she could joke about the situation in their household a lot. And she was a great cartoonist too. In other words, Jackson was not only forced to act as a traditional 1950s housewife, but also felt oppressed and patronized in the role of a faculty wife of her popular and successful husband. She was, especially at the beginning of her career, completely overshadowed by Hyman. And here you have a newspaper clipping showing or commenting upon the publication of Jackson's first novel. It was called The Road Through the Wall, but it coincided, unfortunately, with the publication of her husband's critical essays, critical book called The Armed Vision. And while The Armed Vision was given a lot of attention, The Road Through the Wall was treated rather superficially. And also, if you can see, this is only the beginning of the review. It says The Road Through the Wall by Shirley Jackson, wife of Stanley Hyman, former teacher at Bennington, and author of The Armed Vision. And she was always introduced in this way in the context of her husband being Mrs. Hyman. But Jackson also felt rather overwhelmed by her roles as mother and full-time housewife. In one of her private notes, she wrote, "I am a writer who, due to a series of innocent and ignorant faults of judgment, finds herself with a family of 4 children and a husband, an 18-room house and no help, and 2 Great Danes and 4 cats. It's a wonder I get even 4 hours sleep. It really is. And later she also said, all the time that I am making beds and doing dishes and driving to town for dancing shows, I am telling myself stories. Stories about anything at all, just stories. At the same time, as Zoe Heller points out, Jackson did everything a woman writer can do not to be taken seriously. She wrote about demons and ghosts and used other Gothic paraphernalia. She described herself publicly as a practicing amateur witch, which was in fact a phrase concocted by her husband to improve the sales of her first novel. And she boasted about the tricks she had played on prominent publishers. What is more, she frequently contributed comic texts to women magazines about her life as a housewife and mother. These short, humorous essays on the pleasures and pains of domestic life, which she wrote primarily for money, were later collected and published in book forms. Life Among the Savages and Raising Demons brought her great popularity and were a significant financial success during her lifetime. But they also did a lot to establish Jackson's reputation as a non-serious housewife writer. However, while these critically neglected, rather mass-market books certainly reveal the author's wit and sense of humor, Gothic undertones of domestic life are apparent in their very titles. Under the surface hilarity and light-hearted tone of these sketches, Jackson not only exposes her own anxieties and struggles with domestic life, but also, as Andrew Smith has pointed out, revisits the whole notion of motherhood and the binds that it places upon emancipation. Indeed, recounting everyday struggles of a typical middle-class mother of 4 in post-war America, Jackson invests her domestic narratives with emotional sensitivity typical of her fictional works. She touches, however, gently upon her ever-present feeling of there existing a rather gruesome underside of the most conventional family life. As Eric Savoy has put it, her narrative eye is finely attuned to the potential of the normative household to unravel towards something other, something dark, destructive, psychotic. To put this another way, Jackson writes and consistently invites us to read with bifurcated vision, or with an attention divided between the amusing details of what children do or say and the looming possibility that the savage and the demonic are something other than clever metaphors. Jackson's domestic writing, then, is more than obliquely continuous with her early fictional exploration of multiple personality disorder or her final Gothic masterpieces that delineate the toxicity of family life. The domestic essays brought Jackson money and recognition among the less sophisticated audience who was not acquainted, most probably, with her serious writing, but enjoyed the witty depiction of familiar parental dilemmas. Significantly, for many readers, they were also a confirmation of a woman's most typical roles, that of a mother and a housewife. Yet, to those more sensitive to their affective quality, these ostensibly funny sketches are anything but a record of a true feminine fulfillment. Contrary to Betty Friedan's criticism of Jackson's comic writing as an act of self-abnegation, the family chronicles do not deny or diminish the writer's complex individuality. Instead, as Savoy is right to observe, they reflect, like much of her other writing, what Friedan has famously called a schizophrenic split, or the discrepancy between the reality of women's lives and the image to which they were trying to conform. In the 1950s perpetual celebration of motherhood and the many traditional roles assigned to women, Jackson probes the unspeakable, the dark, repressed undercurrents of female subjectivity, where motherhood is inherently related to feelings of guilt and reproach, and her vision of white middle-class family life is ambivalent at best. By adopting the position of both mother and daughter in her writing, Jackson employs 2 types of plots typical for the female Gothic. One about daughters, which is familiar from Radcliffe, and the other about mothers, familiar from Mary Shelley's model of the reproduction of mothering in Frankenstein. What is more, as in a number of Gothic fictions, the role of the mother in Jackson's novels is consistently problematic, and even if the mother is dead, she does not always... dead does not always mean absent, and physically present sometimes means emotionally absent. Indeed, while in 4 out of 6 of Jackson's novels the mother is dead, she continues to exert a powerful influence on the daughter's life, and the mother's absence becomes a haunting presence that bears directly on the daughter's difficult struggle to achieve selfhood. Jackson's fiction abounds in images of anxious, confused, and emotionally unstable women whose psychological stability and wholeness are forever threatened by their absent yet menacing mothers. One prominent example of such novel is The Bird's Nest, published in 1954, which focuses on the 23-year-old single woman, Elizabeth Richmond, who suffers from multiple personality disorder. While the book was almost unanimously called by critics a psychological horror story, Jackson's preoccupation with the conflicted female psyche goes far beyond the era's growing fascination with psychotherapy and mental illnesses. The main character's split personality and her inability to form a coherent sense of self result from her continuous pathological attachment to her long-dead but still powerful mother. As the protagonist's confused psyche splits into 4 separate selves, one of them sets out to New York to look for the lost unity with the mother, the unity which was always only imaginary. It is this entrapment in the maternal, Jackson seems to be saying, that makes women an easy prey for male domination. In the hands of her male psychiatrist, aptly named Dr. Wright, Elizabeth is gradually molded into a person she was meant to be, a passive, docile, and easily manipulated young lady. The figure of Dr. Wright and his pseudo-scientific treatment of Elizabeth elucidate patriarchy's understanding of the female, placing Jackson's therapist firmly among other powerful men in the Gothic tradition. Dr. Wright's attempts to suppress Elizabeth's troublesome selves and leave only one, the uncomplicated and feminine Beth, confirms Anne Williams's interpretation of the male Gothic convention as that in which the source of horror is not the female in general, but rather the anxiety about the object she embodies, the uncontrollable female principle, which forever threatens to swallow or engulf the speaking subject. In the figure of the pretentious, overconfident, and comically serious Dr. Wright, Jackson also seems to parody her husband, Stanley Edgar Hyman, whose attempts to dominate Jackson's complex personality must have felt equally ridiculous. In the character of Elizabeth Richmond, on the other hand, she dramatizes the internal conflict of many women of the era, torn between maternal constraints, social expectations, and their own deeply buried desires. Insisting on portraying mainly motherless, emotionally fragile, and painfully lonely women, Jackson strove to articulate her own difficult emotions. The feeling of disappointment with her husband's lack of commitment, his sexual and emotional unfaithfulness, and with marriage as an institution which made her feel undervalued and painfully and taken for granted, results in an overwhelming sense of loneliness. In a long and painful letter to her husband, composed most likely in September 1958, she accuses him of being indifferent to her and the children, obsessed with his female students and other women, and of pursuing his career at all costs while neglecting their marriage and family relationships. She finishes her letter saying, "You once wrote me a letter. I know you hate my remembering these things, telling me that I would never be lonely again. I think that was the most dreadful lie you ever told me." These feelings of abandonment by her husband were aggravated by Jackson's outsider status in the town of Bennington. She had never felt part of the local community, and after her solitary campaign against a school teacher who had mistreated one of her children, the writer felt the town's malevolence towards her to become an impossible burden. As Oppenheimer reveals, in the next few years, her feelings of isolation and rejection would intensify, growing to alarming proportions. Gradually, the sense of being surrounded on all sides by hostility would wear her down, finally leaving her helpless, nearly paralyzed and close to madness. This was also a feeling which Jackson felt from the earliest age when she identified herself as an outsider. She wrote, "When I first used to write stories and hide them away in my desk," she wrote in an unpublished essay, "I used to think that no one had ever been so lonely as I was, and I used to write about people all alone. I thought I was insane, and I would write about how the only sane people are the ones who are condemned as mad, and how the whole world is cruel and foolish and afraid of people who are different." The hostility of the world and the inherent evil lurking in people are the themes of Jackson's most notorious but also most celebrated story, The Lottery, which was a literary scandal when it was published in The New Yorker in June 1948. Interestingly, and rather uncannily, it appeared, as you may be able to see on the cover, probably not, in June 26th issue, and the events of the story take place on June 27th. And if you know the story, you will understand why it may have been relevant. But if you don't know the story, I will not tell you, because I wouldn't like to spoil the pleasure of discovering it yourselves. The Lottery generated more negative letters from readers than any other story ever published by the magazine, and many readers even cancelled their subscriptions. Immediately after the story's publication, Jackson received over 300 letters, only 13 of which were kind. And people were generally outraged by the story, but some of them also wrote to ask where the pagan ritual she described takes place so they could go and watch. However, Jackson seemed well aware of the fact that this type of success, achieved early in her career, was bound to overshadow the writer's subsequent literary efforts. In an essay called Biography of a Story, which describes the genesis and aftermath of The Lottery, Jackson wrote, "The Lottery was not my first published story, nor would it be my last. But I have been assured over and over that if it had been the only story I ever wrote or published, there would be people who would not forget my name." And there have been people who have acted as though The Lottery was the only story Jackson ever wrote. Just as there have been people who have read The Haunting of Hill House simply as another supernatural horror, totally ignoring the fact that the supposedly supernatural elements in the novel may as well have a psychological cause. As the events of the story are told from the perspective of the neurotic and tormented Eleanor Vance, it is quite likely that some of the extraordinary events within the house may be projections of her troubled mind. Eleanor, the protagonist, arrives in Hill House with 3 other people to investigate some paranormal phenomena. The protagonist, isolated for years from social life while caring for her invalid mother, sees her visit to Hill House as an opportunity to finally become part of a community, to be one of them, to belong. However, she gradually discovers in the house the archaic maternal body pulling back at her and her own body responding to forces beyond her control. At one point in the novel, she says, "I hate seeing myself dissolve and slip and separate so that I'm living in one half, my mind, and I see the other half of me helpless and frantic and driven, and I can't stop it." The house's maternal space, feared and desired at the same time, gradually draws the protagonist back to that symbiotic unity with the mother. As soon as Eleanor arrives in the house, with the knocker in the shape of a child's face, she begins her regression into a childlike state, sobbing and wailing, "I don't like it here," and finally running barefoot all over the house, dancing and playing. The character's confrontation with the repressed maternal, as well as seeing her own name spelled out in blood. At one point she discovers that there is a message written on the wall in blood, which says, "Help Eleanor come home." So she realizes she has been singled out by the house for some reason. So everything that happens in the house evokes in Eleanor anxiety about her own bodily integrity. As Kristeva explains in her Powers of Horror, To become an autonomous subject, one must throw off or abject all ambiguous in-between conditions that are reminiscent of the original unity with the mother. But when Eleanor opens the door to the library inside the house, she feels the odor of decay which nauseated her, and she whispers, "Mother." She is brought back to the moment of the pre-Oedipal unity with the maternal, and reminded of her own horrifying materiality, which, according to Kristeva, must be repressed so that we may enter the symbolic, establishing the boundaries between I and not I, our insides and outsides. Significantly, the most terrifying moment of the book is not that of haunting by invisible, immaterial ghosts, or hearing the mysterious sobbing of a child. It is the fine bones of fingers Eleanor clutched with both her hands that make her shudder with terror when she realizes there was nobody there. And if you haven't read the story, I will just explain that at one point she thinks she is holding a hand of her roommate while there is a haunting, while they can hear some banging on the door. And in complete darkness, she believes that she's holding the hand of another woman in the room. But when the haunting stops and when they switch on the light, it turns out that this person was away in her bed asleep. So Eleanor asks the question, whose hand was I holding? That's probably the most terrifying scene in the whole novel. So the crucial question that Eleanor asks, whose hand was I holding, points not only to her sense of loneliness, but also to our physicality and temporality of existence as forever threatening. Ultimately, Eleanor's visit to Hill House is a process of regression from her unstable feeling of being a complete and separate thing, through the Lacanian imaginary, to the state of disintegration of the body. I am disappearing inch by inch into this house. I am going apart a little bit at a time, she says. Finally, at the end of the novel, Eleanor seems to have surrendered herself to the process of dissolution, giving up her subjectivity and finding refuge in the womb or tomb of the maternal. And so at the end of the novel, she says, "Here I am inside. It was not cold at all, but deliciously, fondly warm. Under her feet, the stone floor moved caressingly, rubbing itself against the soles of her feet, and all around the soft air touched her, stirring her hair, drifting against her fingers, coming in a light breath across her mouth, and she danced in circles. I have broken the spell of Hill House and somehow come inside. I am home," she thought, and stopped in wonder at the thought. I am home, I am home. Hill House, like other houses in Jackson's writing, becomes a trap, and this trap is also like an abusive relationship, both impossible to remain in and impossible to escape. So what keeps the protagonist entrapped are her own private fears, her feelings of guilt over the death of her mother, and her often unacknowledged desires. So Hill House may be seen to function on several levels. On the one hand, the relationship between Eleanor and the house, which terrifies and finally absorbs the heroine, is a metaphor for the poisonous mother-daughter relationship that Jackson experienced in her own life. What is more, the house may be seen as the ultimate metaphor for the Hyman's symbiotic, tormented, yet intensely committed marriage. And early drafts demonstrate that marriage was crucial to Jackson's vision of the novel from the start. Finally, there is also a question of a complicated homoerotic desire for Theodora, one of the characters, who attracts Eleanor and repulses her at the same time. Eleanor is another of Jackson's motherless, confused, and painfully lonely women who seem to balance on the thin line between sanity and madness. The ease with which one can slip from one state of the mind to the other was one of Jackson's lifetime obsessions. But she was also obsessed with what she called the demon in the mind, the force which exploits one's bad conscience, spinning ordinary worries and grievances into destructive obsessions. So while her early stories are often about people being oppressed and persecuted by closed-minded communities, in her later work, she focused increasingly on the demon in the mind, the evil that afflicts its victims from within. Near the end of her life, Jackson wrote in an unpublished document, "We are afraid of being someone else and doing the things someone else wants us to do, and of being taken and used by someone else, some other guilt-ridden conscience that lives on and on in our minds, something we build ourselves and never recognize. But this is fear, not a named sin. Then it is fear itself, fear of self, that I am writing about. Fear and guilt and their destruction of identity. Why am I so afraid?" Jackson's last completed novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, focuses on two sisters, Maricat and Constance Blackwood, who live alone in an old house. The rest of the family is dead because they were poisoned by Maricat, who put arsenic into a sugar bowl, knowing that her sister is the only person in the family who doesn't take sugar. At the beginning of the novel, the two sisters are shut out of the world outside and shunned by villagers who condemned them as murderers. However, by the end, it is the two women who are shutting out intruders. They barricade themselves in their kitchen, alone and in control of their private universe, and perfectly happy. Shortly after the publication of We Have Always Lived in the Castle in 1962, Jackson's mental health began to deteriorate. She suffered from anxiety and depression and gradually developed an acute state of agoraphobia. "I have written myself into the house," she said. But she was hoping to recover and looked forward to a future in which she would be free from fear. She wrote, "If I am cured and well and all glorious alive, then my books should be different. Who wants to write about anxiety from a place of safety? Although I suppose I would never be entirely safe, since I cannot completely reconstruct my mind. But what conflict is there to write about then? I keep thinking vaguely about husbands and wives, perhaps in suburbia, but I do not really think that this is my kind of thing. Perhaps a funny book, a happy book. Plots will come flooding when I get the rubbish cleared away from my mind." She died in her sleep, supposedly of heart failure, at the age of 48. In her last unfinished novel, the female protagonist, Angela Motorman, after the death of her husband, embarks on a new life, unencumbered, confident, alone, and happy. To conclude, Jackson's novels and stories, while rather diverse in form and themes, were striking not only because they were such accomplished contributions to American Gothic, but because they foregrounded women, single women desperate for social acceptance, or married women trapped in domestic situations and trapped by houses that were so stifling and malevolent that they often became characters in their own right. As I tried to demonstrate, Jackson's use of the Gothic, with its characteristic tropes, serves a double purpose. On the one hand, it may be seen as an artistic attempt to write the author's own suppressed affects into her texts, to give vent to her own feelings of loss and frustration, though in a socially accepted, properly veiled, and daringly elusive artistic form. On the other hand, writing a horror story was probably the most effective way of creating an affective experience in the readers, of making sure that the disturbing feelings Jackson sought to articulate resonate with the audience, inviting them to reenact their own fears, anxieties, and losses. In this sense, Jackson certainly speaks for the whole generation of women who found themselves trapped in their comfortable houses and social roles of housewives and mothers. Just as the original Gothic was used as a mode for articulating contemporary fears and uncertainties in terrifying but defamiliarized forms, Jackson's fiction employs mental instability, fragmented selves, and confining domesticity to channel her concerns about the situation of women in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Though Jackson would never have called herself a feminist, her writing anticipates in many ways Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, and may be read as a commentary on the 1950s cultural politics with its clearly defined roles for women. But there is also, I want to argue, Another aspect of Jackson's writing, which goes beyond her immediate cultural context and which makes it relevant for women of all generations. It is her courage to talk about the demon in the mind, the other in ourselves, or that part of ourselves which we need to suppress to become socially accepted. Jackson's fiction may be seen as a sort of serial investigation of the malevolent, imprisoning power of her own fears, but it is also a fearless attempt to dig deep into the psyche and confront the private demons of an independent, creative individual who had to try all her life to live up to the role of a housewife. Thank you.